This is the Graceful Atheist podcast, a part of the Atheist United Studios podcast network. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Please consider rating and reviewing the podcast on the Apple Podcast Store, rate the podcast on Spotify, and subscribe to the podcast wherever you are listening. If you're in the middle of doubt, deconstruction, the dark night of the soul, you do not have to do it alone. Join our private Facebook group, Deconversion Anonymous, and become a part of the community. You can find us at facebook.com/groups/deconversion. Atheist United, the organization that runs the podcast network that this is a part of, is having an atheist adventure camping trip to Zion National Park in Utah. The trip will take place on November 2nd through the 5th. You can find all the information at www.atheistunited.org/Zion. I'll have that link in the show notes. Remember, we have a merchandise store on TeePublic. You can get all of your Graceful Atheist podcast and Secular Grace theme items there. The link will be in the show notes. On to today's show. I'm flying solo for today's show. I want to talk a bit about the state of the podcast and where I am in this whole process. As I mentioned in the last episode, my work commitments have become greater and greater over time. Many of you know that my wife, who I love and adore, is a Christian, and both of these things severely limit my ability to run the podcast. Don't panic yet. I'm not quitting, but I need to get out what we'll be doing with the podcast going forward. I want to start with a bit of history. If you've heard me tell my deconversion story, I deconverted in the summer of 2015. I spent about a year reading books, being quiet but on Twitter, really just absorbing what it meant to be no longer a Christian, what it meant to be an atheist, what it meant to be a humanist, most importantly to me. Almost immediately, I was talking in terms of secular grace, and I was trying to figure out ways to express that. I was on Steve Hilliker's Voices of Deconversion pretty early on in 2017. That was the first time I told my story publicly, and it felt so cathartic. It was so amazing to just tell the story. I was desperately looking around for a way to impact the community, to continue to tell my story, to talk about secular grace. Way before the podcast, there was a thing called Secular Hangouts on YouTube, where me and a couple of friends from online were just talking about things. It was not terribly well produced, but it was the beginnings of my attempt to express secular grace and my humanism and what it all means. And I knew from that experience that I had a particular voice and a particular view. The concept of Deconversion Anonymous was already there. The concept of secular grace was already there. And I needed to have the full freedom to just express that. Just before this time, I had already started a blog, what is now gracefulatheist.com, and started to write down my deconversion story, the beginnings of what secular grace is, really attempting to express these things. I learned relatively quickly that although I can write okay, that is not the medium that I am the best at. What I found I was the best at was having these relatively intimate one-on-one conversations with people. And thus I knew I needed to do a podcast. In March of 2019, I started the podcast with no expectations that anyone would ever listen to it. My first couple of guests were a pastor from the UK and a young woman also from the UK. And I really enjoyed those conversations. I thought they were great. And I was getting so much out of those conversations. It was a time of my life after deconversion where I needed those conversations. I needed to be able to just talk. After a few more episodes, I realized that what I was doing that was different than maybe other people online, although honestly, definitely stealing from Steve Hilliker, was taking ordinary people and just having a conversation with them. Whereas a lot of my friends online at the time were all focused on the very slim number of atheist celebrities, if you want to call them that. And I knew that wasn't sustainable. There was no way that I could keep a podcast going by just talking to the famous people within the community. And what I really wanted was the honesty and vulnerability and the truth of people's lived experience. And so a number of episodes in, the magic and the intimacy of the conversation that would take place, I knew I was onto something and that I absolutely loved it. In those early days, I was doing a podcast every other week by myself, and that was very difficult. Interviewing, editing, producing, the whole thing, doing everything from scratch. The pandemic hit in 2020. I continued to do the podcast and was continuing to love it. I was beginning to feel the strain of the time and effort to put into the podcast. And I began to reach out in late 2020 for people who would be interested in participating and helping. Mike T responded, and in late 2020, he edited a couple of episodes, and I was saying, hey, we'll figure it out if it's going to be every other week or once a week. And I think by January 2021 episode, I said, let's try to do it every week. Mike T has been amazing. He has been here from that day, never complained, has done more than 100 episodes. I don't have the immediate count on top of my head. And he's volunteering his time. And I am incredibly grateful for the work that he has done. We went to once a week, which was more demanding. Although I was now not doing the editing, I still had to schedule and do interviews and do final production when I do the intro, outro, and put all the music together, that kind of thing. So it was still a lot of work. In late 2021, I put out the call again for people who would like to participate, and Arlene responded. Arlene jumped in and helped with the community. We started Deconversion Anonymous, or really expanded it, and she became the community manager. I know almost everybody listening to me who's ever been a part of the Deconversion Anonymous group will know that Arlene's work has been incredibly invaluable. So we expanded there as well. Arlene was also helping with copy editing, the blog posts. Basically from that point on, Arlene was writing the copy for show notes and things of that nature. In 2022, during the summers are always a difficult time to get interviews done, get the production done. I was really struggling to do once a week, and I asked for people who would be interested in hosting. So Arlene again stepped up. She did a few interviews. And you all know the rest of the history that we wound up going to an every other week process where I would do the interview for 1 week and then Arlene would do the interview for the next week. And we've done that basically since late 2022. And so obviously Arlene's contribution to the podcast has been invaluable and consistent over time. And I am very, very grateful for the work that she has done. That brings us to 2023. In 2023, my work became significantly more demanding. I've had much less time to conduct interviews, and just the process of scheduling, conducting the interviews, and then producing after Mike T does the editing and Arlene does all the copy. And even with Arlene doing an episode every other week as well. Also in 2023, I found that 8 years on from my deconversion, I no longer feel the need the way that I did in the beginning. The experience is different. If I'm being honest, it feels like work at this point. One of the reasons that it feels like work is at each step of growth in the podcast, it required more work. And this was a ratchet that never got less. So that now we do, especially between all of us, between Mike T, Arlene, and myself, we're doing a lot more for each episode. The reason I did this is to grow the podcast, to grow the audience. It always felt like it was at least one of the goals of the podcast was to grow. And as you know, there are lots of people who do podcasting for a living. I have a day job and I can't put the time in. So this summer, when we hit kind of a lull again, I found that I was struggling to get interviews lined up. Arlene continued to do great work, but I have been struggling. So here's what I'm thinking about now. I want to recapture some of that early time when I didn't care if there were 3 people listening or nobody listening. I feel like I've been really focused on growth and metrics and maybe the wrong things, honestly, over this time period. The demand to have an episode every week, or on any cadence for that matter, means that there were times where I released an episode that I wasn't 100% proud of. And I don't want to do that anymore. I want to recapture the voice of those early days, the Graceful Atheist, secular grace, humanism, honest conversations with believers. And I want to take the time pressure off. The absolute most difficult part of producing the podcast is doing it on that cadence. So if I take the cadence pressure off and say I will release when I have a good interview or when the interview is ready and produced, I can give myself that freedom to do that, to take that pressure off. So that is where I am at. So I want to slow down. What happens next? First, I think we're going to try to run out 2023. We'll try to keep going. I'm not going to promise. So if a week goes by and there's not an episode, you know why. At the end of 2023, I'm going to take a break for at least a month, and we'll see how long it lasts. I want to, again, regain some of the passion for the project. If you are a supporter on Patreon, I completely understand if you need to stop that support. You can do so guilt-free. 100% you are free to do so. If you would like to hang on and see what we are able to do in the future, I would love that, but honestly, will not hurt my feelings at all. If you signed on with a once a week cadence and a certain expectation, and I'm going to change that, it's okay if you need to change your support or level or what have you. From the get-go, I wanted the Deconversion Anonymous community to be independent from the podcast, and it will remain so. Arlene tells me that she will continue to run that. So as long as Arlene is willing or some other community member is willing, that group will go on regardless of what happens to the podcast. I want to express how grateful I am that you all have come along this journey with me, that you are out there listening, that when I started, it really literally was 20 people, 30 people for a fair amount of time. And now we're in the thousands, and it's astonishing to me that anyone is listening. Again, I think the credit goes to the guests being honest and vulnerable and telling their stories, and that magic of hearing your story when someone else is telling their story. That is super powerful, and I think it always will be. For the many of you who recently have sent me emails saying that you would like to tell your story, I really do want to get to you. It is just going to take time. It's going to take a long time. And so if you can be patient, I will reach out to you over time, and I'll have you on. So again, this is not the end. This is just a change. And we'll all be on this adventure together to see what happens next. Thank you again for listening. Next week, Arlene interviews Jeremy. You're not going to want to miss that episode. Until then, my name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. The beat is called Waves by Mackay Beats. If you want to get in touch with me to be a guest on the show, email me at gracefulatheist@gmail.com. For blog posts, quotes, recommendations, and full episode transcripts, head over to gracefulatheist.com. This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast, a part of the Atheist United Studios podcast network.